Assalamu alaikum. Welcome our dear students in a new unit electricity with the first chapter electrostatics. At the end of this chapter, you will be able to identify the two types of electric charges, explain the electrification by friction, distinguish between conductors and insulators, explain the electrification by induction, explain the electrification by contact, and calculate the quantity of electric charge. There are two main types of electricity that we will learn this year: static electricity and dynamic electricity. Static electricity is the branch of electricity concerned about static charges called electrostatics, and dynamic electricity is the branch of electricity concerned about moving charges or flow of charges through a conductor that we will study it in the next chapters. In this chapter, we will learn about basics of electrostatics, electrification, and calculation of charges. Let us see these animations. Watch how the child's hair spikes as he slides down the plastic slide. Sometimes, when we touch the handle of a door or even another person, we receive a shock. In these two examples, observe how a balloon can attract a falling water and pieces of paper. See how this man can attract the box by another box and without the presence of a magnet. But how can we interpret these events and how do they occur? The interpretation of these phenomena and many other events of daily life will be in the study of electrostatics in this chapter. Let's observe this example. We approach a plastic rod like a pen toward the pieces of papers. We observe nothing takes place. Now approach the piece of fur toward the pieces of papers. Also we observe nothing takes place. In this experiment, we rub the plastic rod with the piece of fur. Then approach the rubbed plastic rod toward the pieces of papers. We observe that the rubbed plastic rod attracts the pieces of papers. Now also approach the rubbed fur toward the pieces of papers. We observe that the piece of fur will attract the pieces of papers. Finally, we conclude that the plastic rod and the piece of fur become charged. Let's observe experiment 2. Rub two similar plastic rods against two similar pieces of wool. Suspend one of the rubbed rod on the thread of a stand where it can move freely. Approach the second rubbed rod that you handle to the suspended one. We observe that the two rubbed plastic rods repel each other. We analyze here that the two plastic rods became charged, and since the two similar plastic rods are rubbed against two similar pieces of fur, then they should have the same type of charges. Now approach the piece of rubbed fur towards the plastic rod. We observe that the plastic rod and the rubbed piece of fur attract each other. But wait, if the plastic rod and the fur carry similar kinds of charges, then they should repel each other. So we conclude here that the types of the charges carried by the plastic rod and the piece of fur after rubbing should be different. Here in experiment 3, we will use a glass rod and a silk cloth. Rub two similar rods of glass against two similar pieces of silk. Suspend one of the rubbed rod on the thread of a stand where it can move freely. Then approach the second rubbed rod that you handle to the suspended one. We observe that the two rubbed glass rods repel each other. Finally, we can analyze that the glass rod and the plastic rod became charged, and since the two glass rods are similar and are rubbed against two similar pieces of silk, then they should have the same type of charge. Now, what happens if we approach the piece of rubbed silk towards the hanging rod? Approach the piece of rubbed silk towards the hanging rod. We observe that the glass rod and the piece of rubbed silk attract each other. But wait, if the glass rod and the silk carry similar kinds of charges, then they should repel each other. Finally, we can say that the types of the charges carried by the glass rod and the piece of silk after rubbing should be different. Here we have a note. When two objects are rubbed against each other, they will be charged with different types of charges. In experiment 4, we rub the plastic rod on a piece of wool and suspend it on the stand. Then rub the glass rod on a piece of silk and approach the glass rod towards the plastic rod suspended on the stand. We observe that the glass rod and the plastic rod attracted each other. We analyze here that the glass rod and the plastic rod have been charged. And since the charged glass rod attracts the charged plastic rod, then the two rods should have different types of charges. Now let's recognize. Electric charges can be appeared by friction. There are two kinds of charges which they were proposed by Benjamin Franklin, the first internationally known American physicist. The two kinds of charges are positive charge acquired by the glass rod rubbed on silk, negative charge acquired by the plastic rod rubbed on fur. So like charges repel each other and unlike charges attract each other. Here we should mention two notes. Note 1. The two kinds of charges may be called any name, but the notation positive and negative makes sense because the same amount of positive charges added to the same amount of negative charges, it will give zero charge. Note 2. We may interchange the names of charges. Conventionally, all physicists use the same names as given by Franklin. Now we observe what happens if we approach the charged fur towards the plastic rod, then towards the glass rod charged with different signs. Charged fur attracts charged plastic rod, but repels charged glass rod. Likewise, the charged silk cloth repels the plastic rod and attracts the glass rod. In fact, with many other experiments, we have not found any charged object capable of attracting or repelling these two rods at the same time, which confirms to us that there is not a third type of charges, but only two types, and thus no charged object has been shown to be able to attract or repel positive and negative charges at the same time. Now we have two questions to ask. What happened when we rubbed the plastic rod with a piece of fur? Also, what happened when we rubbed the glass rod with the piece of silk? To explain what happened, let's first make a quick recall about the structure of matter. The matter is composed of atoms, where each atom consists of a nucleus made up of protons and neutrons, and electronic clouds where electrons present. Protons are positive charges, where electrons are negative charges. Here we have an important note that the number of electrons equal number of protons, so it will be a neutral atom. In a negative ion, the number of electrons is greater than that of protons. In a positive ion, the number of electrons is less than that of protons. Now back to the previous experiment. Initially, the piece of fur and the plastic rod were neutral, having the same number of protons and electrons. Upon rubbing the plastic rod on the piece of fur, some electrons will transfer from the fur to the plastic rod. Then the piece of fur loses electrons and becomes positively charged, and the plastic rod gains more electrons and becomes negatively charged. Similarly, when a glass rod is rubbed with a piece of silk, some electrons will be transferred from the glass rod to the silk. Then the glass rod has a deficit of electrons and becomes positively charged, and the piece of silk has an excess of electrons and becomes negatively charged. Let's notice that the positive charges cannot be transferred by electrification. They stay always in the nuclei of the atom. Only electrons can be transferred by electrification. Application 1. Interpret why the hair of the child spikes when he slides on the plastic slider as shown in this animation. When sliding, there is a friction between the hair and the plastic slider. So some electrons are transferred from the hair to the slider. Then these hair become positively charged, then are attracted to the slider and repel each other. Dear students, now it's your time to perform your own experiment, and don't forget to film it and send it to your teacher. Now let's make a quick summary for what we have learned in this session. Electrostatics is the accumulation of stationary electric charge on the surface of an object. Electrification is the process by which an object becomes charged. There are two types of charges, positive and negative. Electric charges of same sign repel, electric charges of opposite sign attract, and finally, during electrification by friction, there is a transfer of electrons between the two objects. One loses electrons and becomes positively charged, while the other gains electrons and becomes negatively charged, according to the ability of each object to lose or gain electrons.